back in Washington, he uses a couple of
Sure.
at least once.
So you were talking about Heidegger and trying to get beyond subject-object distinction in the being and time stuff in particular.
Hmm.
And I was just saying that when I read that, I treat it as in part having Hegel as an antagonist. I mean, there's lots of people who are thinkers within the subject-object distinction, so to speak, but
Hmm.
Hegel is probably the one who develops it the most, right?
Okay, I thought it originated with Descartes.
It does. It kind of originates with Descartes, and all of modern philosophy is, leaning on the
Hmm.
subjective pole more. But Hegel is the guy who's going to make the dialectic of subject and object like the kind of basis of his whole sort of philosophy analysis. And
Hmm.
and in Hegel, in particular, part of the idea is that the object itself is also produced by consciousness. So there's this kind of subjectivism underlying subject and object. The object is what stands over against the consciousness as projected by the consciousness with contents that are borrowed from, the categories that are meaningful to the consciousness, something like that, in Hegel, right?
Hmm.
And compared to that, Heidegger in Being in Time is trying to make a point that being there is something like always already outside, or always already in contact with the outside world. And partly this is getting to some stuff he got from Husserl. The point being that the Hegelian picture that consciousness is the interior of the mind, or the interior sense, and that objects are the exterior sense projected by the mind, but still viewed as exterior. That inside outside mental image, so to speak, that Hegel runs with is to Heidegger, partly based upon some previous work by Husserl, a kind of falsification of the phenomenological evidence, because the phenomenology is that man is always already oriented on things outside of himself, and uh, a later way of putting this would be a cognitive science way of putting this would be to say something like uh, the mind is not an interior machine. It has windows, right? It's programmed with windows, right? It's always open to the outside, right? Is receiving apparatus not interior consciousness apparatus, right? So receiving apparatus is always coupled to that from which it is receiving. You cannot view it simply as an interior because it's an interface. So in later terms, to think of the nature of being there as always already plugged into the world is meant to be a replacement for the idea of a hermetically sealed consciousness on the one hand and a world that it creates or projects on the other, as though there's an interior cave of the mind, and there are the movies thrown on the walls of that cave, and that's the movies on the walls of the cave are the objects, and the rest of the mind is the rest of the cave is the subject, and the whole thing is the movie running in the cave, right? That mental picture, some of it which does go back to the cave stuff in Plato, is kind of the subject object dialectic in Hegel, and Heidegger is consciously disagreeing with that, and some of the phenomenological method and pre-scientific, if we put it this way, evidence for that was already there in Husserl. It was already something that Husserl was trying to do in a way, but Heidegger certainly took it much farther in Being in Time than Husserl ever had. Husserl discovered things like there's a structure of intentionality in mental acts that has a pointer-like character to an outside. It's not trying to refer to other contents of consciousness, right? And so Husserl has already noticed some of those hooks into the outer world, if I can put it that way, as being characteristic of the nature of consciousness, and that's sort of the starting point for the whole Being in Time project, that where Heidegger tries to flesh all that out a heck of a lot more, and famously discovers all this built-in structure, so to speak, to the point where he'll say finitude is built into the structure of the mind, for example.
Husserl said that.
No, Heidegger. I'm saying
the horizon. Yeah, the horizon idea.
Yeah, partly the horizon idea, but I mean the from the evidence of being in time, an infinite mind is round, square, and a misunderstanding, right? So you know, things like that are places where Heidegger took some entering wedges into trying to get through the subject-object distinction, and instead think about consciousness as an interface between inside and outside, not as just the inside, so to speak, and to understand that traffic, right? The way in which the mind is always already plugged into the world, and that being on the outside in this aspect of it that Husserl had already discovered hints of in intentionality, Heidegger is going to make into a giant thing that winds up blowing the idea that the mind is inside apart completely. The mind is not an inside.
By the way, can you remind me what's the label Heidegger puts on that whole thing, that whole project?
I mean, he just calls it phenomenology.
Okay, so because
the project that is started by Husserl and furthered by Heidegger to go back to the evidence of the contents of experience in order to discover the structures of experience, or the structures of the conditional possibility experience. That is phenomenology to Heidegger, and in a way it has a precursor in Kant, but Husserl, his teacher, is the guy who he thinks really starts down that road in the method he himself thinks that he's using.
Mm-hmm.
I say he himself thinks he's using because there are Husserlians who will think that Heidegger is not simply doing Husserlian method and is gone off on his own tangents and is way more of an intuitionist than Husserl is in some ways. But those are intramural debates within phenomenology about people that wanted to follow Heidegger where he went, and others that go back to Husserl. But yeah, anyway, all of that was on trying to get beyond the subject-object distinction. I like to think of this partly in terms of stuff going back to pre-moderns as well. I remember reading a secondary source on one of the medieval scholastics or mystics of the Middle Ages, and the modern author was trying to explain what the subject matter of the book was saying, or how he was thinking. And he was trying to explain it by contrasting it with Descartes, because he thought Descartes would be more familiar to people, right? And so he says that here the question is about the nature of the unassisted human mind, right? And a flag instantly goes up, right? Because the person he's discussing, this is Meister Eckhart, there is no such animal as the unassisted human mind, right? The human mind is always already assisted by that about which it is trying to think, which is the being that supports it and into which it is plugged, right? The human mind is not in those earlier philosophers a separate standalone existence of its own. It has a substrate which is structuring how it is and acts. In later cognitive science terms, right? The software is running on some hardware, but there is a substrate of the mind that is the reality in which the mind is embedded, that is always an aid to the mind in what the mind thinks. And
it was called hardware by the cognitive scientist type.
That's a later, somewhat distorted version of it. But yes, I mean I'm getting at the fact that partly this is the old Stoic distinction of that there are things which subsist as opposed to existing in their terms, right? They require some substrate in order to exist. And to the medieval scholastics and Christian mystics and so forth, a substrate of reality was necessary for the human mind to exist, right? They weren't a separate consciousness of which you could be certain, a la Descartes, yet, right? In a way that's on the ground of certainty rather than how you think the human being is constructed, trying to get human being or consciousness to stand on its own. But to the thinkers before Descartes, the fact that human minds did not stand on their own was patently obvious, right? So it would never have occurred to them to view the world as simply a projection of the interior consciousness, because consciousness to them already needed a substrate in order to exist, right? So anyway, that's this point about the subject-object distinction and the roles that have been played with it from dogmatic philosophy before the moderns, Descartes and his doubt of things, and then Kant and his Copernican revolution of thinking that the contents of consciousness are always only what the consciousness always include the structure of the consciousness as or the mind has, or the understanding has put on experience. All of those different moves, it are kind of a major part of the history of modern philosophy specifically, and Husserl even before Heidegger, but Heidegger especially, thinks that some of that has been, I'm going to put it this way, too subjectivist or too inclined to view consciousness as simply an interior, right? And then they give themselves the question of how can we get to the exterior from the interior, right? And the answer is, as soon as you defined everything in consciousness as interior, you can't. Or at least you can't pass any kind of skeptical doubts or skeptical counter objections. But anyway, that's the kind of sort of traditional problematic that Heidegger was, from my point of view, definitely tackling in Being in Time, and wanted to show that subject-object distinctions too hard cast were obscuring the evidence of the in communication with the outside, all in quotes, nature of being there, with outside in quotes. Okay, so Peter's joined us. I sent a ping to Jim, but he hadn't actually signed up, so I don't know if he's going to be here. But we gave him 15 minutes on the ping, so we should probably get started. I want to frame a little bit what this session is different. We don't have a reading. We're just going to assess, the whole, especially since March stuff, meaning we're supposed to be assessing this, but we read, some of us read Being in Time the year previous as well, so we can assess that part too. There's a couple things about this. One is we get to be more synoptic. We get to take in the whole view of everything we've learned about Nietzsche, everything we learned about Heidegger, everything we learned about history of philosophy from multiple points of view from them, and anything that tells or teaches us. We also get to assess what we think of it, what we make of it, which parts of us convinced us, which parts didn't. We can talk about influences and later developments informed by it. Places where you had problems, not in the sense of understanding, but in the sense of I fully understood it, but I wasn't sure if it was true kind of questions, assessments of it. I still want it to be about Nietzsche and Heidegger, not, yes, we read all this stuff about Nietzsche and Heidegger, but this is other thing I remember from Aristotle and I like better, right? We don't want to go off into tangents that are just like some entirely different view of things. But certainly any assessment of what to make of Nietzsche, what to make of Heidegger after all this is germane now for the first time. There's been ways in which I've tamped down people wanting to react with what they think about all of it before they've understood it. We're through that now. We're allowed to have any degree of independent reaction and assessment we want. We don't have to stick to trying to understand what what either Heidegger or Nietzsche had to say. Go, Joe.
Okay. One thing I've been pondering for the past week is the epoch idea. And you introduced this, at least I realized that this was being introduced by Heidegger, because we had the ancient time in which it was sort of disclosing, the clearing, and you come to the clearing, it's now part of the world, I guess, what you know about. And then from the Descartes thing, where we sort of moved into the epoch where it was the representation and whatever Descartes was doing. And now there's a third epoch, the modern era, the post-Hegel epoch, post-Kant Hegel epoch. And I just want to get more to that. You pointed out that this idea of being actually has a history of what
Yes.
different philosophers at different stages of thinking about these concepts was passing through. And I want to discuss that more. In particular, I'm wondering how I understand there's a Muslim idea by perhaps Al-Ghazali and others called instantism or something. Something only exists because God is thinking about it.
Occasionalism, that's a different
Okay,
thing.
yeah, okay, whatever it is, where something only exists because God is thinking about it. Well, that sounds to me like they have sort of put God into the center place, that he's the being thing in their view. When I accurately say that that's their ontology? Could
So,
you?
okay. Some of this you're anticipating the kind of stuff we'll get to in Gilson, which we're going to read next, right?
Yes, I'm eager for that. I've looked through Gilson.
And partly the idea we've already encountered in Heidegger is the ontotheology idea. But it's certainly the case that understandings of being and theology have been entwined since at least the Greeks,
Yeah.
if not before. Some people will say metaphysically even before, but certainly by the Neoplatonists, say, and anything after that. And we'll get into some of that in Gilson, but there were Neoplatonists who weren't Christian yet, but had a theology that was a theology of the one, so to speak, based upon a Platonism that then informed a bunch of early Christian theology, although not all of it. And then versions of that mixed with Aristotle were imbibed by medieval Islam, especially medieval Islamic philosophers as opposed to theologians. And so you get different multiple different theologies with different degrees of dependence upon either Platonism or being thought back to Parmenides or something like that in medieval Islam. And then the later Christian West, the era of the scholastics, High Middle Ages Christian West, from say Albertus Magnus Aquinas onward, has imbibed all of that in the sense of they also read the Arabs reading the Greeks, right? They get their Aristotle from Averroes, right, who's a great commentator on Aristotle. So there's a trans-civilizational theological, metaphysical subject matter, right, where they're not all simply agreeing with each other, but they're playing recognizably with the same palette and instruments, so to speak, on that field of doctrines of metaphysics, doctrines of being, and theology, right? So now in all of that, where does Ghazali fit in all that? Ghazali is fundamentally a skeptic within that Islamic tradition who is skeptical of the positions of the Islamic philosophers as opposed to theologians. In that, he himself, studied all the Islamic philosophy of his day, but he, famously had a kind of skeptical break with all of it. And he decided that all the things that they pretended they were certain about, they were not actually certain about. Their logic and their math was certain, and all their metaphysics was not. And people were confused by the fact that these were men who understood the nature of logic and logical demonstration into believing that their metaphysics and theology were as demonstrative as their logic or their math, and they aren't. And anyway, he took all that in a through skepticism in a kind of a mystical direction. But the kind of motivating principle behind occasionalism is only partly theological, and it's partly simply skeptical. Many of the same arguments are used for it by Ghazali that would be used by Hume to attack the possibility of knowledge of causality, for example.
Hume didn't argue for a God to be doing it for you.
No, but both of them share an antithesis in that both of them are arguing that there is no access to a philosophical certain knowledge of causality, right? The theologians, because they don't think a causality could constrain the freedom of or omnipotence of God,
Mhm.
and Hume, because he doesn't think that the human mind has access to anything which concatenates one circumstance with the other than mere habit, right? Mere repetition. And that means that both of them view one happening succeeding from another as entirely causally distinct from one another. They don't view any causality as sewing together the instance of time, one for a skeptical reason, the other for a theological reason. But as I'm saying, in the case of Ghazali, they're joined, because his rejection of Islamic philosophy is based upon his skepticism, even before it's based upon his theology.
I see. Thank you.
In the West, that same kind of argument that you got in Ghazali was made also by William of Ockham. He's kind of the Western version of that Ghazalian omnipotence of God against causality argument. But anyway, the point, one of the points of the contrast between Ghazali and Hume is that the cultural impact or effect of very similar philosophical arguments, in this case for skepticism, in two different cultural milieus can be entirely different. And that's partly because in the case of medieval Islam, the Aristotelian philosophers against which he was disagreeing were people like Averroes, who were thought of as very secularizing philosophers. And Hume was disagreeing with the same Aristotelian scholastics, but they were Aquinas and they were the church doctrine, right? So the difference is that in one case, the philosophical Aristotelians were completely on the outside of theology. In the other case, they had already been brought into Christian theology by Aquinas. Although before Aquinas, there was that same attitude towards a lot of the Aristotelianism, because previous Christian philosophy had mostly been based on Platonism rather than Aristotelianism. But anyway, that's a bunch of that stuff we'll get into in Gilson and other things like that. In terms of these epics, there's more of them than just a few. I don't think a strict periodization is what Heidegger is after in this. He's instead trying to get at something like every fundamental philosophical doctrine defined an age, something like that. And there are continuities in there which are not simply sharply periodized, right? So all of the moderns share something from Descartes. There's also ways in which Kant is quite distinct from Descartes to Leibniz, and Hegel is continuing Kant, but also going in a different direction, which is an even more subjective direction than Kant was, right? And Nietzsche is not Hegel. He's overthrown even the notion of objective truth there was in Hegel. So there are, in Heidegger's way of laying out the history, there are breaks smaller than entire epochs, if I can put it that way. But the claim is that this metaphysical structure that is constant throughout that history is something like the understanding of what truth is and how it happens is controlling of all these other reactions. There's a meaning of being and an understanding of what truth is as the appearing of being to man, that each of them will have some doctrine on, and these other changes are going to follow from their understanding of truth, basically, their understanding of being and their understanding of truth. Anyway, so partly that's he's saying this has a history. He's also saying that history has a kind of invariant structure insofar as it is metaphysics. It doesn't necessarily have to have that at all previous times or all later times, but within everything from Plato to Nietzsche, the claim is all of it does follow this structure. So he is both claiming to have discovered, highlighted at least that historical nature of metaphysics, as opposed to its self-understanding, which was that it was trying to be a timeless understanding of the invariant truth, something like that. But also that there is a logic or structure that it follows, which a Hegelian would call, in the nature of the concept of metaphysics itself, something like that. But that Heidegger is also trying to highlight. Yeah. Okay. So, but yes, this when Heidegger is doing philosophy, history of philosophy, it's not quite the same thing as philosophy of history in a Hegelian sense, but he does claim that something like truth has a history. A Jacob Burckhardt might say that truth has a history in the sense that what was discovered, they would talk about, the different epochs of discovery or something like that. But they're still looking at it as though there's one standard truth and there's just more or less of it being uncovered. That is not what Heidegger is doing, right? It's not the kind of history that he's detecting. It's
By the
not.
way,
Go ahead.
Thomas Kuhn
Yes.
sort of leaps into this thing in the 1950s, I believe, and
Yes.
sounds to me like his cycles or whatever they
Yes.
do after a
Yes.
scientific
Structure of
revolution
scientific
is very
revolutions. Yes. So yeah, I mean, that absolutely. So Kuhn is an attempt to apply this kind of structuralist history understanding to science specifically, as opposed to philosophy, right? And that is definitely indebted to not only Heidegger, but also other social scientists who took off from both Nietzsche and Heidegger and have tried to apply this in areas besides philosophy as well, in anthropology by people like Levi-Strauss, and in linguistics. But other sciences of man tried to go looking for these kinds of structures as well, to find the they were looking for things which were invariant, which weren't simply culturally relative, but which were invariants of the structure of what would otherwise be viewed as potentially culturally relative things, if we put it this way. So whether it's patterns of primitive thought or ways in which language structures understanding of reality, those are both things which the anthropological structuralists and the linguistic structuralists tried to detect in different cultures, different languages, right? As opposed to thinking that each one of them, because it structures those things, can structure it with complete freedom or completely different from one another. So finding the invariance in the things which would have looked like they were separate because different cultures is kind of what the structuralists were about. And partly that's replacing a kind of Nietzschean cultural relativism with a more Heideggerian informed structuralism, if I can put it that way. People like Merleau-Ponty also tried to do this with what we would now call cognitive psych, or the phenomenology of perception was his particular thing he was looking for structure in. And partly that was trying to disagree with some of the stuff that Hegel had gone through in phenomenology of spirit, the early parts of phenomenology of spirit, with a more Heideggerian lens, if I can put it that way. So the point is, there was plenty of this work going on with people influenced by Heidegger in, say, the 30s through the 50s in other social sciences. And a lot of that got called structuralism. There were other things involved in structuralism that weren't as conscious of the fact that they were influenced by Heidegger, right? But the people who were doing the most important work of it were definitely conscious of the fact they were. Kuhn is influenced as much by those people as by Heidegger himself, right? And then he wants to give a notion of historical change in scientific paradigms, which is not the usual progressive story, if I can put it that way. The Enlightenment progressive story is that one science succeeds another only if and when it is the previous one is falsified by the crucial experiment, right? And so forth. So there's a Baconian prescriptive, this is the way science should go view of the history of science, right? And Kuhn is trying to empirically explode that as culturally and historically naive compared to a version of those changes which is more informed by the Nietzsche, Heidegger, and structural social science view of these things, so to speak. And that was immensely influential because it gave a kind of history of science cachet to ideas that had been previously associated entirely with continental philosophy in a way that was sort of thought of as kind of out there, especially in the Anglo-Saxon philosophical world, right? The positivists wouldn't pay any attention to anyone from Hegel to Heidegger because they were just those continental philosophers who are going on about spiritual things, and everyone knows that spirit is bunk, right? But then Kuhn said, actually, the way your sciences change is more informed by that than it is by your Pat Baconian stories about how it's supposed to work. And at that point, people sort of sat up and took notice. So that's sort of kind of a capsule version of why, where some of where Kuhn was coming from and some of why he matters. And then other people like Foucault ran with that same idea. They were doing the same kind of things in other social sciences. He was looking for the scientific revolutions and things which were way less scientific than hard science. He wasn't looking for scientific revolutions between the replacement of the Copernican, the Copernican worldview replacing the Ptolemaic worldview or something like that. He was looking for it in modern psychology, replacing Freudianism, replacing silly ideas of phlogiston or whatever in the 19th century, right? So he was Foucault was especially interested in the pseudosciences, the structure of pseudoscience revolutions, if I put it that way. But yeah, so fair to point that out. I mean, this general method got reused in lots of other places. Some of that is indebted to Heidegger specifically. Some of it's only indebted to Nietzsche. Some of it is just a terrain opens up for playing on the history of thought, and some of that was already there in people like Hegel and philosophies of history. And Marx is taking Hegel's philosophy of history and rearranging the actors a little bit. So it wasn't like people hadn't seen this game before, so to speak, as a major sort of intellectual revolution endeavor. But all that analysis got a lot more sophisticated in the 30s to the 60s, I'd say, because their cultural understanding and their philosophical understanding was now informed by Nietzsche and people like Nietzsche and Heidegger and people influenced by them, instead of just people like Hegel, Marx, or Herder. Okay. I've got tons of reactions, but I want to hear you guys' reactions first, because this is a chance for you guys to assess all the stuff we've done in a very long period of time, and tell me what you learned from it or didn't. And Brian.
Well, I have to say some of you, I think, I don't know everybody's background, but some of you seem to be, have dedicated more of your life to philosophy than I have. And Heidegger is claiming a privileged space or status or position for philosophical thought. So, which is fine with me. I'm glad to defer with that. And also I'm glad to defer to your opinions and your thoughts. I really appreciate it. But just a key thing is something you said earlier, that something like the theory, I didn't write it down, I was going to write it down, but the theory of truth determines or influences each epoch. And I would turn that around and say that each epoch also influences our understanding of truth.
Sure.
And I think it should be that way if you're going to give the status to being, which Heidegger would like to give.
Right. So I mean, the classic version of this discussion is trying to remember the guy's quote. He says something like, "The question is not whether or not the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether in the long run anything else does." So that's the kind of claim being made here, right? And yes, there's a lot of, if I can put it this way, historicist, culture of their time, determinist kind of philosophies of history that will instead read all directions influence the other way. They'll say, this mass thing going on in culture or politics influenced these thinkers, and that led them to think this, that, or the other thing, and that may have had some repercussions. But they're seeing the thinkers as sounding boards being played upon by the passions and social movements of their time, so to speak. So the journalist level happenings of your century determine the interior of philosophical thought, something like that. And that's a kind of view of historical determinism that's from this wider society or culture into the thinker, instead of from the thinker through time to the next thinker, and then all of the subsequent cultures and societies being influenced by them. And those are two very different ways of drawing sort of the causal influence arrows, so to speak. I think that Heidegger and Nietzsche are so influential culturally precisely because they make an extremely plausible case that that's not the direction of influence. The direction of influence is not that social pressures and how you were brought up and your Freudian relationship with your mother determine your passions, and that determines the contents of your philosophical thoughts. And then those, if they have any influence, are only influencing broader cultures, which are then forming and shaping the next person. So that each thinker is the child of his time and not in dialogue with the thinkers before him or the structures of the things he's thinking about, but only with the rest of his life, so to speak. That's the view that Nietzsche and Heidegger are exploding. They're saying, no, actually, the way culture works is a much more top-down thing than that, and a much more thought-centered thing than that. And these influences radiate from pure thoughts about truth and philosophy that influence what we would consider ideologies, that influences all those other things in daily life. And that direction of travel is more influential than the previous view can account for. And not only that, they're fundamentally influencing each other through time. It's not a horizontal influence from their culture into them. It's a forward in time influence of them on each other. So there is a historical chain of peak philosophical or peak spiritual thought world influence. This is exactly the thing that the sort of Marxian determinists of the 19th century were disagreeing with, or they didn't want there to be a ideological superstructure thing that was influencing history in its own autonomous way. It had to all be from the bottom up, right? If you understood economics, you would understand interests, and interests would tell you what people thought, and then so the unfolding of thoughts would only be an epiphenomena of the unfolding of economics and social forces and politics, right? That's the opposite of what's being claimed here. It's a go ahead.
That's fine, but I think I would underline, to me, in what you've said, I accept and agree with everything you said. I think different philosophers are highlighting different things. I don't think each one doesn't have the whole truth, and I think that it does go both ways. And Heidegger might be saying that the most important, I don't want to paraphrase, I don't want to change your words, but the most important is the history of thought.
Yeah, it's not simply a matter of most important. It's not it doesn't go both ways. It's the claim that there is a sphere of culture that is intellectually unfolding by its own logic in a way that influences tons of other things, and that is not explicable as just an epiphenomena of social causes or interests or psychology, right?
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
And when I say that Nietzsche and Heidegger
I don't think that Heidegger's the only one who said that. I think somebody like Max Weber said that.
Absolutely, and Weber said that in large part because he was influenced by people like Nietzsche, right?
Right. So,
I'm
so
saying
to say that it's all Heidegger, it's not all Heidegger. It's so
no.
it's just not.
I'm saying that that there's a reason that this entire body of continental philosophy thought of the influenced by German idealism variety, right, is as culturally influential as it is. And that's way bigger than Heidegger, certainly. It includes people back to Leibniz and Kant, and it includes people like
Well, look, you could
Weber
say
and,
that it's the
and
thought. Yes, I agree that it's the validity of the thought. I love this thought. I love all this stuff. I've been reading it my whole life. But there are historical events which have affected it.
of
There's, I
course,
have to say, there's World War II. There's a
of
lot of
course,
professors that came, a lot of professors that came out of Germany to the United States. This is not just their thought. These are
sure,
significant historical events which have
sure,
impacted universities in the United States, thinking
sure.
around the world. It's not just these people's thought.
Sure, but the idea that world wars just happen without being influenced by the thought of people like Nietzsche is also naive, right?
No,
I
I'm
mean,
not saying it is. But to say that, look, I think that this thought from Heidegger
it's not even from
merits in
Heidegger,
some
but
ways the same from Heidegger merits the same skepticism, the same shade that he threw on Protestantism, which is it's just following the lead.
uh, yeah, I'm making a much simpler claim in my own mind, which is that there is a degree of later intellectual and cultural influence that the thought of people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, and before them the German idealist tradition generally and continental philosophy has had, that is, to my mind, in large part due to the fact that they seem to be the only people who are doing justice to this direction of causation in historical change, right? There's lots of other people who are trying to explicate every other possible direction of the causal arrows in historical change, but nobody else is taking seriously enough or doing enough justice to the direction of purely intellectual and from elite thought outward direction of historical change. And the tradition of based of continental philosophy centered on German idealism, and especially in the cultural thinking of people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, has given full justice to that kind of elite logic of thought, so to speak, direction of influence. And that was something that was systematically shortchanged before them. Maybe not for all of history, but certainly by the standards of the rest of the 19th century, which was, running off and looking for economic, social, and psychological influences bottom up on everything, and was conceiving of historicism in that direction or in that way, as a broader cultural, broader, more numerous cultural forces on thinkers' direction of causal flow. And Nietzsche and Heidegger are explicitly drawing those arrows in the other direction. And if you think of people later, think of the postmodernists later, they are absolutely agreeing with Nietzsche and Heidegger against their own previous traditions on that respect, right? Derrida is not a Marxist because he thinks that Marx is wrong about the direction of causation between economic and intellectual things. He thinks the intellectual things are driving the ideological ones, not the social ones driving the thoughts, and so forth. Right?
Well, then there's just, I mean, I love all this stuff, and I love what you're saying, and in many ways I defer to it, but I have, you're not, I mean, and again, being willing to say anything in this area requires courage because so much is left unsaid, always, I think. But it's not, the 19th century included Marx and determinism, but it wasn't just Marx and
Sure.
determinism. And even the Enlightenment put a lot of emphasis on the power of thought. So to
Sure.
say that this is Heidegger I just don't see that.
No, I don't think that that's the. I don't think that that is a new Heidegger discovery. I think it's a reason that this whole school of thought is influential. Those are two different statements. I'm not saying this is Heidegger. This is what's original in Heidegger. What's original in Heidegger is the stuff about the structure of the life world and being in time, and the stuff about this, notions of truth having a history stuff in what we were just looking at, and things like that. That's what's new and original in Heidegger. this general importance of the cultural importance and independence of the cultural sphere, and even the elite philosophical influence within the cultural sphere, is way bigger than and longer than Heidegger, right? But it's part of why it's important, influential, taken seriously, etc. Right? Which is not particular to Heidegger. It's bigger than Heidegger. Okay, but that's still a good reaction. That there's the kind of assumption of the of choosing it to think about as worthy of thinking about in the first place, which is that this stuff is influential because this direction of causation matters, right? Something like that. Pete, do you want to give sort of reactions either to just this part of the book or to the whole Heidegger project we've been doing? I know you've been reading Heidegger before this, so.
Yeah, so for me, what I got out of it was incremental. So I learned a lot more about Nietzsche's Overman and the eternal recurrence and value that are the things that Heidegger's interested in. And I learned a lot more about him. I still don't understand them completely. I couldn't, regurgitate Heidegger's interpretation of the eternal recurrence of the same in a paper, but I'm certainly more comfortable with that material now. And I also picked up some, more details about Heidegger, like in his critique of subjectivism, the difference between the subjectivism of the Platonic dialogues of man is the measure of all things versus Cartesian subjectivism. And so that's what I got out of it. And in response to what Joe was asking about Kuhn and paradigms compared to Heidegger's epochs, I would say that they're similar in idea, but different effect. With Kuhn, those changes to a new understanding of the solar system or biology can just happen within science. So the astronomers can go from being Earth-centric to being heliocentric, but they're still using the same geometry or the calculus. But Heidegger in particular, is interested in being. And so his epochs are different understandings of being. So where the paradigm changed in such a way that what truth meant, or what he calls the being of beings, how phenomenology manifests itself. So, for example, Plato thinks that things are an imperfect version of the pure form of the thing. And Aristotle says, no, it's about the thing itself, the ousia, or it's about how somebody made a thing and what their intentions were. And so to Heidegger, that's what he's focused on, is how at different times there's different understandings of being. This new thing that we've forgotten about until Heidegger came along and reminded us,
right.
reminded philosophers.
I was drawing all the direction and influence of how Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts came from these things out of Nietzsche and Heidegger, especially Heidegger. But you're right that if people are familiar with Kuhn enough that they're comfortable with the notion of a paradigm shift, one way of thinking about Heidegger is he's trying to track the paradigm shifts in philosophy, and specifically understandings of being, and what effect it's had on later philosophies whenever that paradigm did shift. It's fair if someone is much more comfortable with, you know, the scientific change understanding that they've learned from Kuhn, right? It can help them process Heidegger to see that he's talking about paradigm shifts in philosophy.
Yeah.
Joe.
So that's
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, Pete. Go ahead.
No. So that's my summary. You know, what I got out of reading Heidegger on Nietzsche, and just my reaction to, you know, Kuhn and the relationship between his paradigm changes and Heidegger's box of being. You know.
Did your understanding of Nietzsche change significantly in the course of this reading of by Heidegger?
I don't know about significantly. I mean, I understand those particular things in the late Nietzsche, but I still see Nietzsche as a classicist philosopher, obsessed with Wagner, and also articulating this new understanding of things, of being, without the theological one always behind you saying, and of course God created everything. And so he's kind of the one that takes a bunch of influences, things that were going on in the 19th century, and says, okay, well, if we remove the and God created everything as the cause of everything, then what are we left with? Well, we have values, and they're relative to each other, what they were to the ancient Greeks, or they had a different value system than the Christian value system and the modern value system. And so to Nietzsche, still to me today, he's more interesting as a classicist, the origins in the Greek beginnings, the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, and the eternal recurrence of the same, the everyman, isn't as influential in my way of thinking.
Which I think that's similar to Nietzsche's cultural impact, which is primarily through, I would say, through philosophical relativism more than anything else. It's also it's just noticeable that in that areas of influence, plenty of the early Nietzsche or the mid-late Nietzsche, by which I mean the Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals Nietzsche, is mentioned in what you're talking about, and the Zarathustra Nietzsche is downplayed a bit. The sort of more prophet-like Zarathustra Nietzsche is closer to the one that Heidegger is stressing the importance of. But yeah, that's fair. I mean, we'll get to some of my reactions in a little bit, but to me, one of the most useful things about this book is just to draw very sharp distinctions between Nietzsche and Heidegger, right? It's otherwise easy to conflate them from the same tradition they're coming out of, but you can't finish reading this book and think that Heidegger simply agreed with Nietzsche, and that is useful from my perspective to note there are two quite distinct positions. We'll talk about some of the similarities a little bit later, but Joe, reactions?
Well, it seems to me, first, this is the only detailed exposure to Nietzsche that I've encountered at all. So I'm not changing an opinion, right. I'm forming one.
Yep.
But the point remains that I've heard of Nietzsche referred to almost continually by people that want to say negative things about other persons, like they're Nietzschean or something.
Yes.
And
it's a term of abuse, just like nihilism was for.
Exactly so. Now, the reason that Nietzsche is interesting, particularly as Heidegger has laid him out, is that I think he claimed that he was going to be the end of metaphysics, and perhaps he is because he sort of killed it off. And Heidegger comes along and says, well, wait a minute, this is not really what we're looking at because we're looking at the epoch of these whole things as they transpire over time. And there's a whole better view. And we sort of get that as he sort of comes out against Nietzsche in this very subtle, indirect way, and not against all of him, but against these things. One reason why Nietzsche is very interesting, particularly to, let us call it the emerging atheistic zeal of intellectual people. You know, you go to college, you learn that God doesn't exist. Okay, I mean, that's the common complaint. The Christians say it all the time. Don't send your kids to college, they'll come back not believing in God. Okay, let's just take their prejudice for a minute and run with it. If Nietzsche actually ended metaphysics, what he's doing is sort of celebrating the fact that when you say, because you know, truth is posited. You're Superman, right? You've made yourself because you've discovered these things. You say that truth is now through my eyes, and I just posit that. And that's, I think, in many ways what people on the streets today, social justice warrior types, are doing, whether they know it or not.
Not just them.
Because yeah, I know, but
I would say we're living in a fairly let's put it this way. It's not necessarily a Nietzschean world in the sense that people are conscious Nietzscheans, but it is a world relatively well described by Nietzsche's understanding of opinion formation. Let's put it that way.
Very good. Okay. Now, so Heidegger comes along and says, wait a minute, there's a better framework. And of course, it's the one he came up with about 30 years earlier. And that's quite fascinating. So if metaphysics in the sense heretofore is sort of changed, we now see why it changes through these epoch phenomenon, things as history advances. And I think that's a very plausible, very interesting explanation. And Kuhn comes along and says, okay, well, let's just take this sort of thing and put it into science. And yeah, I think that fits.
Yes, but when you know that you're living in a particular philosophical, or for that matter, scientific epoch that has its that undoubtedly has its unconscious distortions and its preconceived, unquestioned opinions that are probably wrong and probably going to be superseded whether they're wrong or not, does it change at all the attitude that one has towards either the philosophical or the scientific truth of one's epoch? Because you're now not really expecting it to last.
No, but if you believe in change, I mean, the whole Parmenidean thing? Was it Parmenides? Anyway, where everything comes out of chaos. I was saying earlier today, what is it? Yeah, what is chaos after all? And that's just when it has never been sort of organized in any way. It doesn't actually come into anything that you would think it's coherent, and therefore it's of course not unclosed. It's not disclosed in the sense of the Greeks. And but the fact that it's not organized, and once it starts coming forward, let's say in modern times by Descartes, it becomes organized because he thinks about how it's going to be represented to him. So, and not all of chaos, but everything comes out of chaos. And what he recognizes as these now are the beings, are these things that I can actually comprehend.
So I'm gonna first of all, multiple different understandings of chaos, but certainly the one that kind of Nietzsche is starting from is the idea that it is an absence of order that is something like just the an overwhelmingly changing set of sense impressions onto which some order must be imposed to make sense of it, so to speak. So that the opposite of chaos in that sense is order, or cosmos, but cosmos as an imposed categorizing explanation producing thing. meaning-producing thing. That's different from the original notion of chaos that Heidegger points out when he first brings it up. That the original Greek sense has more of a sense of a yawning open or nothingness from which beings emerge, something like that. So it was originally more about the being or not being distinction and less about the order or disorder distinction, and it later becomes about the order disorder distinction.
Well, that's because beings emerge, and then you have the question of what are they?
Right, but right. So the point that the point involved in Heidegger noticing that Nietzsche thinks of the beings as that which is organized by the mind out of a background chaos, right, is to view the beings themselves as works of art, as human constructions and works of art. They are not simply mirroring a something already there in nature. They are a changing what is already there in nature for human purposes in this artistic refashioning and practical, technical way. Right?
Okay, which one originated that idea? Was that Heidegger or was it Nietzsche?
That's Nietzsche. That's Nietzsche. Nietzsche is definitely originating that idea. Heidegger is pointing out that that sense arises as a kind of replacement for the idea for the sense of chaos in which appearing against the background of nothingness is the original sense of chaos, right? So order disorder is to Heidegger a less fundamental distinction than to be or not to be, so to speak. But that's kind of an aside that Heidegger is throwing at Nietzsche of how well did you read your Greek, so to speak. And when Heidegger tells a classicist he's not reading his Greek well enough, But the thought in Nietzsche is that the non-subjectively viewed is meaningless chaos. Non-subjectively viewed original world is meaningless chaos of sense impression, and the every ordered cosmic thing is a human creation, right? That is what that's trying to do is remove the notion that because something is a work of art and is a human construction and has a kind of freedom or play in it, that this makes it a distortion or a falsification. Because the claim is that every such cosmos is always already a work of art, is always already an interpretation, is always already on a background of human purposes, is a cultural construct within a horizon, etc. There is no objectivity outside of that constructing activity to Nietzsche. And
that's Nietzsche. That's Nietzsche.
That's Nietzsche. And that's even what's fundamental to Nietzsche. That's why Nietzsche is thought of as kind of the relativist, the cultural constructivist, because this is the core claim that in Nietzsche that such order as we see in the world, we put there ourselves for our purposes, something like that.
That's why the art part is actually the first part of these 4 books of Nietzsche that we are going through.
The world is a work of art that gives birth to itself is the Nietzschean formula. But this is also, the art is worth more than truth, and we have art so that we don't perish with the truth, right? These are the kinds of typical Nietzschean aphorisms on the subject.
I hear that coming from an opera, almost like these starving bohemians.
Yes, well, we talked about how he liked Wagner, right? Yes. The modern version of Nietzsche's infatuation, if I can put it that way, with Wagner is something like wanting to believe in heroic narratives, because the heroic narratives that make life meaningful make life more attractive than the mundane reality of modern bourgeois existence, something like that. So people seek the heroic in art because they want to be the heroes of the heroic tale, right? And in the 19th century, the place that people of Nietzsche's set got that was not the movies, which didn't exist yet. They got it from opera, right? So the superhero movies of the 19th century were Wagnerian operas.
I agree. They even resurrected the Wagnerian characters in some way.
Yes, now we go to the theater to watch Thor. They went to Beirut. Okay, I want to talk about reactions to Nietzsche. Right? one of the things going on here is that Nietzsche is giving you a criticism, sorry, Heidegger is giving you a criticism of Nietzsche. And maybe you don't need one, right? Maybe Nietzsche is so alien to you that you've got 6 ways of dismissing Nietzsche in your right hip pocket, and you don't need another one from Heidegger. But there's a question of how much does Heidegger's criticism of Nietzsche hold up? What do you make of it? Does he have a good reason for dismissing Nietzsche? Does any of Nietzsche survive Heidegger's procedure, if I can put it that way? This goes back to Pete's point about the Nietzsche he thinks of as the cultural critic, or as the debunker of mystified worlds that have gods behind the scenes. So there's a question of how much Nietzsche is left after Heidegger is done with him, so to speak. Is Nietzsche a dismissible, smoking irradiated ruin when Heidegger is done with him, or is there elements of the critique of Nietzsche and Heidegger that you didn't buy or had a different take on? What do you make of Nietzsche post this reading of him? Is what I'm trying to say. And maybe the answer is I didn't make much of him to begin with, but that's fine. That's an answer. I'm wondering, for some of you, it was a relatively maybe the deepest exposure to Nietzsche you'd had, and maybe there are parts of it you found attractive and others didn't. But what was left standing or not left standing about Nietzsche for you after all this? Go, Joe.
Okay. So, as I already confessed, this is my first exposure.
Yes.
I was not I was not at all surprised, because so many of the things that we encountered were things that were totally were familiar to me as background, or as things that people commonly assume. Because you appreciate, I've been reading, let me call it atheist literature for maybe 40 years. And some people are pretty deep, but I don't know where they're coming from as a philosophical grounding. And I'm interested to know how many of these people are nuts. You introduced me to Jordan Peterson, and I'm very pleased, because I don't think he's a nut. I think he's very interesting. And of course, I discovered Ayn Rand some decades earlier, and I sort of think she is a nut, but then I sort of again think she isn't, because I had opportunity to read Nathaniel Branden's take on what she was presenting. I didn't actually read it. I got much more deeply exposed to it. And it seems to me that she's not a nut, but she's sort of a little bit lost. And she does something I heard was accused, she's very Nietzschean, and I wondered what the hell does that mean? I heard it as the negative.
But both the people mentioned have been influenced by Nietzsche, certainly. Go ahead.
Yeah, obviously that's now clear, and I see why and how. Rand clearly went off on a tangent, and that's not my focus here.
Yeah.
But I think that Heidegger at least shows me a greater, hell, I hate to say, a greater mainstream path to follow, a path that is not full of tangled paths off to nothing, off into the woods of confusion. And so that's one reason I was pleased to see his discussion of Nietzsche, since Nietzsche was so influential in the development of everything that we've led up to here now.
That's fair. I want to. I would caution against the word mainstream about Heidegger. Yeah, it may be a more intellectually coherent criticism of Nietzsche than you might find in some other places, but I don't think it can be accused of being mainstream.
I don't know how wide the stream is.
I just mean that Heidegger is very esoteric, and there's not many people. I remember when I was, at the U of C, and I was ready to finish writing a dissertation on Heidegger, and I looked around and I thought there may be 6 people in the world that would be interested in this. But anyway, that's
why should you care about that?
Right.
I mean, I appreciate.
I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying that when I think of the importance of Heidegger, mainstream is not the word that leaps to mind. Influential certainly, but not because he's mainstream. Okay, Pete, did you want to remark on my question about what's left of Nietzsche? And while you're answering, I'm going to get a cup of coffee. Right back. I'll be hearing you though.
Okay, so kind of like Joe, I think Nietzsche's just very influential today both in politics, culturally, and relativism. Yeah, and also I would say identity politics, and I don't know how good this criticism is, but I see him as kind of a counter Enlightenment figure in Romanticism, and because he's German, he's caught up in this 19th century thing about what is German identity, because they weren't a country yet when he was born. And, the Germans were struggling. Oh, are we Bavarians or Prussians? Are we a German people based on the language or these different tribes? And so I also see that in Nietzsche of part of what are our values is what do we identify with, and I see that as a reaction to the Enlightenment that, oh, we're all scientists now and we all speak Latin and we can talk to each other about science without getting into this, oh, the Germans hate the French and we'll never talk to each other. I see Nietzsche as a reaction to that, and so I see him everywhere today. I kind of when I was growing up, when I was 9, man landed on the moon, and so I had a sort of idealistic sense that we were progressing and we're going to move off planet, and the future would be some kind of meritocracy like Star Trek. And since then, it's just been one disappointment after another about political arguments that I think have lost their taken their eyes off the ball of, oh, we're all human beings, and we're progressing. We've came out of the water, stood on 2 feet, and we're going to the stars. And
yes,
no,
partly that's the I agree with you that he's part of this kind of counter Enlightenment movement in continental philosophy generally, and that does get its start with Romanticism and reactions to the French Revolution, and he's definitely in that milieu. Nietzsche is kind of way more scientific, atheistic, and positivist in in many ways than most of the other people in that milieu, which is one of the reasons he's interesting and influential beyond that milieu itself. But I want to get on another thing here. It's not just the progress idea, because the progress idea is kind of exploded by this horizons idea, but because one is kind of a replacement for the other. But we do have to ask the question of how wide a horizon of advantage. You brought up, what is humanity doing, and there's different horizons of advantage and different degrees of solidarity / cooperation that people or consciousnesses can see with one another. So are the needs that your consciousness is bodying forth as it chooses this way of categorizing the world to understand and navigate the chaos, are those needs of life? Are they needs of humanity? Are the needs of civilization? Are the needs of one culture? Are the needs of one faction within one culture? Are the needs of one race, one class, or one gender, right? So depending upon how wide or narrow you see the scope of the cooperative, the scope of the shared identity in all that, you expect more peaceful sharing of concepts, paradigms, understandings of things. And the more narrow you draw it, the more you expect those things to be in conflict with each other, right? If some way of categorical thinking is an expression of life, then to dispense with it is to die. If it's necessary to the survival of humanity, then to dispense with it is to join the human extinction movement or something. But if it's only the needs of a particular culture, then maybe another culture doesn't need them, and maybe they're in conflict with the needs of that other culture. And it's only the needs of one party, then maybe you're a fool who's letting your enemies rule you if you adopt that way of understanding the world. And this the thing which is characteristic of this, it's all an artistic human creation view of all of our fundamental categories, is it's not specific about that level. It doesn't tell you which of these things is controlling. It's kind of free and open, and that means it can serve as a universal acid for dividing one group from another, right? The ideas that you're expressing are your interests, but your interests and my interests don't coincide, even though we're both human and we're both alive and we're both, in the same civilization or something like that. If it's viewed as an expression of something inherently different and competitive enough, then it can become a reason for us to be disinclined to listen to one another, right? And this is all put in the context of it's a competition, but the competition can be against the nature of the world. It can be a competition against barbarism as opposed to civilization, or it can be a competition between this party and that party. And how narrowly or widely you draw those lines determines how much the Nietzschean view results in conflict or cooperation. And Nietzsche himself kind of doesn't try to settle that for you, but he, if anything, he's erring on the conflict side of it. Nietzsche is the kind of person who will, slyly, insinuate that you should take another good, hard, empirical look at the evolutionary value of evil, right? You shouldn't assume that your moralism means that anything evil is bad for humanity. Why does humanity have evil in it? If it's so bad for humanity, it's had it for as long as it's existed, and it seems to have helped it survive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So those are the kinds of immoralist thoughts that Nietzsche is famous for. But I'm just pointing out that this different. You could have a more cooperative version of Nietzsche if you think that the identity that's involved in your concepts or your way of thinking about the world is up at a level that all human beings share. But you can also take it down to the level of the finest grained political distinctions and turn it into a way of dividing people into weaponized camps, right? And anything in between. Go ahead, Joe.
I recently encountered that an idea that seems to fit in here, and I want you to comment. Somebody contrasted the Marxian view with the Bastiat view. Mm-hmm. Bastiat, the French writer who was famous for economic harmonies and things like that.
Yep.
Whereas Marx with his, the war of the proletarian against the capitalists and stuff.
Right.
I don't know that this conflict view was actually articulated in earlier writers in philosophy about these things. I can understand how the underlying detail, namely that there have always been a lower class that were just peasants and paid taxes and died. And then there was an upper class that sort of collected taxes and lived high and wrote philosophy books. And so, something's going on here. And the conflict idea that creeps in.
So first of all, let's distinguish between the conflict idea and the class idea, right? Because the thing which is particular to the 19th century Marxist view is that it's not that there's conflict, but that the particular basis of the conflict is economic class, right?
Yeah.
And because the view that the fundamental is conflict goes way back to the Greeks, right? You find it in war is the father and king of all in Heraclitus. You find it in the Thrasymachus and Callicles of the Platonic dialogues. There's like a known hard-nosed political realist cynical position, right? That views justice is the advantage of the stronger. It's what the ruling class claims is just because it's good for it. Right, and that's the characteristic sophistic view against which Platonistic moralizing arises in the Platonic dialogues, whether in the Republic or the Gorgias or Protagoras. Right, it's the characteristic sophist position that led, in Aristophanes' term, that they were blamed with making the unjust speak the stronger, or the weaker speak the stronger. This conflict view is deep and is there in philosophy as something which continues from the beginning, and it's it's treated as a hard-nosed, no flinching look at reality kind of way of understanding politics or society. You get that in Thucydides too, as opposed to the Sophists. So, but none of that was directly tracing it to class, right? To trace things to class, you have to fundamentally see there as being a kind of base economic cooperation of all mankind in their metabolism with nature, to put it in Marxian terms, right? If competition can arise, scarcity competition can arise, even within that, there's another reason for it, right? But the original of that position didn't start from all of mankind being an economic cooperative in metabolism against nature, which is kind of the modern view that comes in with Descartes, or the Enlightenment. But previously it was just, political societies and cities were divided by war. And they fought one another because, one or the other could not survive. One or the other took the other's land. They enslaved each other routinely in war. And the competition view of human life was just regarded as the power politics, brass tacks, no flinching look at empirical reality, right? Moralizing views had to arise against that background or in opposition to that background, and they had a hard case to make that social life was cooperative in some fundamental way instead of being fundamentally competitive. There's a famous thing in the Gorgias when Callicles, who's one of the Platonic characters, is a sort of proponent of this view, is debating Socrates, and Callicles thinks that like Thrasymachus, justice eventually the stronger, and he thinks of himself as the stronger. And Socrates' famous rebuttal to him is, well, if justice is eventually the stronger, then the many will devour you. They will defeat you easily. And Callicles says, why do you think that? And he says, well, there's many more of them than there are of you, so they are physically stronger than you. The rule of the stronger means the rule of the demos. And this is the argument that Socrates makes against Callicles. And the point is that there's a kind of incoherence in the put this way, the kind of cynical but elitist view of the Callicleses and Thrasymachus of the world, that they think that their cynicism is going to result in them ruling, right? But they're not more powerful unless they are deferred to on the basis of conventional property rights, respect for morality, respect for their social position, and all these other things that fundamentally rest upon moral claims that they are busy debunking. And the point that Socrates is making is, if you don't leave room for a morality, for a reason for people to defer to you, right, your cynicism is just undermining your position, and you're just going to be food for the revolution of the masses who are going to overthrow you because you have 1 ounce more silver than they do, right? So the sort of Socratic rejoinder to these cynics is that they think that they're stronger, but it's a conceit. It's a self-deluding conceit that they're stronger. They would only be stronger if they were smarter in some way that was a moral superiority or a wisdom superiority, and they're debunking the moral status of such wisdom superiorities with their cynicism. So the cynicism and the power claim don't go well together when the thing that you're excelling at is supposed to be highfalutin cleverness, something like that. Another way of putting this is, if you get into a power competition, will the philosophers win it? If it's a cynical race to the bottom, will philosophers win a race to the bottom? The thing that is likely to win a race to the bottom is likely to not end up being philosophy. Stanley Rosen has a line somewhere where he says that Nietzsche is powerless to prevent the interpretation of power as success, right? He may have a sense of a notion of rank in which the most refined will to power is the most culturally aware understanding of all the history of the past, that can understand all past history and assimilate it and understand it and make it its own, etc. But his successors don't need to aspire to any of that. To learn from him that their needs can be expressed over his needs and just dismiss him. Anyway, so that there's a kind of tension between the cynicism of the view and the sort of elitist basis of the view. Now, to be fair to those people, they think that their superior understanding of how culture works or how society works or how morality works is the basis of their claim of superiority, right? Do they have a better understanding of the mechanisms of culture? But the mechanisms of culture don't just sit still. They can be reordered. They can be torn apart. They can, be downgraded. I've read one interpretation of what Derrida was trying to do, is to try to take the cultural mechanisms of Nietzsche and democratize them, make them available to everyone who had attended a deconstruction seminar, so that it would not be a preserve of elitist German philosophers, but could be something that every college-educated Western intellectual could aspire to, which is, true enough in a way, but it kind of undermines some of the transmissions belts of Nietzsche's dreams of philosophers being the powerful rulers. If all the people that they're using as their seconds that are propagating their doctrines are all little deconstructionists reinterpreting them in their own image instead, and substituting their own will for his. But the farther you go along that line, you realize that that the people on the receiving end of the propaganda of the deconstructionists can do the same move. And as I say, philosophers don't win races to the bottom, right? The most flippant dismissal of the Pomo deconstructionists as can pull the same move on them that they just pulled on Nietzsche, right? So anyway, you go from Nietzschean elitist philosophers to Derridian intellectual revolutionaries to populist shitposters, and each one is just dismissing the previous by going to a more superficial level and not trying to assimilate the previous level, but just trying to find a pose to dismiss it from. Anyway, that's just part of this interpretation of power as success problem, if you can put it that way. But backing up a little bit, the Nietzschean understanding in its own terms is most reasonable when it does pay attention to these wider horizon advantage. When you do have to think, actually, I should learn from this person because we are cooperating because the thing he's expressing is something fundamental to life or humanity or civilization, right? And it's not the particular needs of his particular party or class, right? So to the degree to which those identities are shared because the problems being confronted are shared, it's still a cooperative endeavor, so to speak. But if not Nietzsche himself, certainly many of his successors have stressed the competitive dynamic aspect of that, and they're more inclined to detect the interests in someone else's structures of thought that are reasons to not listen to them than the ways in which they have something to teach you about navigating the structures you have to deal with yourself. Anyway, that's a little bit of what I learned about reactions to Nietzsche and from this reading of him. So I have other thoughts on all this stuff, which I'm now eager to get to if I haven't exhausted everybody else. But so I have some pointed questions for the Heidegger we've been reading. We're told that everyone has forgotten being. Now, being is now it's a verbal action that describes the ongoing event of existence in time, right? So is this meant to be the remembrance of being, or is it the obliteration of being and its replacement by becoming? Has becoming stolen being's name? Because the supposedly forgotten being looks a lot like the unfolding event of happening in time of the world that previous philosophers talked about as becoming, not being. And that would mean that the being that was left behind is the idea of something like eternity. Heidegger likes to point out ways in which people like Plato seem to be fleeing from finitude. Is he fleeing from infinitude? So we're told that Nietzsche is consummate subjectivity, right? And we have to replace it with the perspective of Dasein as the being there or sight where being appears and all truth is disclosed and happens as the open and the free. Is the Dasein worldview of being in time not consummate subjectivity? It may be a slightly different understanding of subject, maybe a deeper understanding of subject, but it still seems to be very much an historical horizon-bound subjectivity of a kind that Nietzsche would recognize. So what I'm getting at in both these questions is how indebted is Heidegger to Nietzsche? He's stressing all the ways in which he's different, but it's still a philosophy of something like the horizontal interior of something like a replacement for consciousness as being there that is all about the happening, unfolding event in time, replacing concern for the eternal or transtemporal. And although he has made being a valued term again and usurped becoming from its Nietzschean position, and although he has usurped the term subjectivity and replaced it with the term existence, still, from the standpoint of any previous dogmatic philosophy or even Kantian idealism, Heidegger is an historicist, subjectivist philosopher, right? That's the category he would fall into in any typology that is not interior to his own understanding. Anyone who's drawing their typology from outside, they're going to lump Nietzsche and Heidegger together here and see tons of ways in which Heidegger is heavily indebted to Nietzsche. Thoughts on that? Pete is smiling.
So if I read the Heidegger of the 20s of Being in Time, he's totally indebted to Aristotle, and there's almost no Nietzsche. And then in 1935, when the Reich says this is going to be the syllabus for philosophy, and this is what you're going to teach about Nietzsche, this is when Heidegger leaps into action and says, no, they've got it all wrong. I'm going to teach Nietzsche properly. And he does what he'd been doing to other philosophers. So, he explained in Being in Time that there's this different understandings of being. And so he lectures a few semesters on Kant's understanding of being, on Hegel's understanding of being, Plato's understanding of being. And in 35, he decides, well, I got to do Nietzsche's understanding of being because these people in Berlin completely misunderstand Nietzsche. So from that sense, you think, well, Heidegger's already figured it out, starting from Aristotle, and now he's just explaining Nietzsche in his own terms, in his terms. But at the same time, he never stops thinking about Nietzsche. He never sets him aside after that. And we hear from, I forget if it's his brother or maybe it was Hannah Arendt, who said that in the shortly before he died, 1970s, he said that the philosopher who most troubled him was Nietzsche, and that he never really felt comfortable responding to Nietzsche, and it's Nietzsche who kept him awake at night. So I sort of have those two views of Heidegger.
So I entirely agree with most of that, except I want to go back a little bit to the claim that the Heidegger and being in time is just based upon Aristotle.
Well, and his lecture courses where he's explaining being in time through the Nicomachean ethics, through the physics.
I know, but neither Aristotle nor any of the great medieval Aristotelians wrote being in time, or could have, or would have, right? The perspective that we're going to understand being by understanding the being that understands being as, you know, as this being their thing is heavily indebted to modern subjectivism, right? That move
Husserl, right?
does well into Husserl, absolutely, right? But because Husserl is indebted to Descartes, right? So the elements of Descartes and elements of even the phenomenology of spirit, right, have influenced Husserl, that have set, you know, outlines of method and what counts as rigorous philosophy to the Heidegger of being in time. And the subject matter he is trying to talk about might include Aristotelian metaphysics and what it means to be a thing, so to speak. But the way he's thinking about it is decidedly modern and way more subjectivist than anything you get in Aristotle.
Right. So in his terms, he's rereading Aristotle as a phenomenologist.
Yes.
Which hasn't been done before.
Right. But the point is, as a phenomenologist means as a Cartesian influenced modern of the specific strand influenced by Hegel and Husserl, right?
Yeah, but then that's Heidegger's step, is to go beyond Husserl.
He's definitely going beyond Husserl. I'm just saying that he's coming from a tradition that is, you know, deeply modern and deeply indebted to the modern subjectivist move. And what is striking about this is that when he wants to criticize Nietzsche, the fundamental criticism of Nietzsche is that he's too damn subjectivist, right? But the entire method of the phenomenology is a subjectivist method. Right?
But it's a response to Cartesian subjectivism.
So is Nietzsche, right? In his own way. He's claiming that the Cartesian subjectivism is too intellectualist and not embodied enough, and that's kind of where Heidegger is going to. He's going to find you the fundamental structures that underlie the experience of consciousness or the experience of the ego, right? So he's in the firm tradition of finding the unconscious structures that order thought, whether it's in mood or anything else. The stuff he writes about mood and being in time could have been written by any Nietzsche-influenced Freudian, right? Not that they would be. It's too philosophic. But my point is that it's striking that his fundamental criticism of Nietzsche is that he's so subjectivist, but his own starting point is extremely subjectivist. Now, I do think he is trying to take that to a place which goes beyond subject-object in his own understanding of things. The distinction is real, but he is still a modern from the traditions he is denouncing. I'm going to put it that way. The other thing you notice in this critique of Nietzsche is there's something like a attendance to the requirements of thought that is something like a piety of truthfulness to what being announces, something like that, in the middle and later Heidegger, that reads almost like a deliberate moral flipping, if I can put it this way, of Nietzschean influence on command. Right? He does not. Nietzsche is saying that truths are prescribed by men to reality to organize it into something that they can deal with, and Heidegger wants there to be something like a letting beings be, thoughtful attendance to, almost obedient listening aspect to thought. The listening as opposed to the commanding is what I'm bringing out as a contrast, right? It's almost like when Nietzsche says that there's no such thing as the pure, still voice of reason that is purely obedient to the nature of things, a transcribing of what is. That's what Heidegger's fundamental objection to him is. Nietzsche is too activist, too commanding, too prescribing to nature. It is the challenging, revealing, right, as opposed to stilly listening, right? And from Nietzsche's point of view, right, this is exactly the thing he's railing against in the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, where he's, claiming that the philosophers have thought that there is a purity available from on high if you only listen and don't rule, right? It's the quietism of listening as a morality in Heidegger that is, to me, the sharpest contrast with Nietzsche. They're agreeing on subjectivist method, and they're agreeing on becoming development as opposed to eternal being, but they're disagreeing violently on the morals of thought. Nietzsche thinks if you're not commanding, you're deluding yourself. And Heidegger thinks if you're commanding, you're distorting, and you have to be piously listening instead, something like that. And to me, that's a kind of revival of the will to truth that he sees Nietzsche as attacking the purity of. There's a kind of pious moralism of thought, if I can put it that way, in Heidegger that you don't get in Nietzsche, that Nietzsche was a debunker of, that Nietzsche ridiculed previous philosophers for believing that their intentions were pure, so to speak. So that to me is a place where the contrast between them is not that one supersedes the other, but they're just fundamentally different moral outlooks. One wants thought to be an obedience to what's there, and the other wants it to be a conquering, transcribing, writing what shall be there. I bring up the writing part of that because to me that's also there in Derrida. Derrida is definitely on Nietzsche's side of that one. He doesn't like the pious listening aspect of Heidegger, and it reminds him too much of religion, and he likes the writing aspect of Nietzsche that is just going to, I don't have to listen to the world, I can just obscure it by writing my own invention on it. But that active versus passive morality of thought, so to speak, listening versus commanding, to me is like the most striking contrast between Nietzsche and Heidegger that I think comes out in this book. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's different levels there. First, it's weird to talk about Heidegger and morality to begin with.
I agree.
I think in terms of method and direction and stuff, but that he's guided by morality. I think he's saying
it's not anybody else's morality. It's his own understanding of morality. But I'm thinking of the parts at the end of the Nihilism Mystery of Being thing that we just read, where he's objecting to the prideful standing on its own aspect of what he sees in Nietzschean subjectivism, right? The evanescence of the hail takes the openness of the holy with it and closes it off. The closure of the holy eclipses every illumination of the divine. The deepening dark entrenches and conceals the lack of God, right? I mean, all of that is his rejection of Nietzsche as way too prescriptive modernist, right? Precisely because it is incapable of something like a piety of listening to being that lets beings be, if I can put it that way, right? And that's a kind of morality. It's not anybody else's morality. It's not a cultural morality. It's not, but it is a standard for how thinking should conduct itself, supposedly coming from the activity itself, something like that.
Right. Okay. So I think I interpret Heidegger's quietism as specifically an ontological tool. That if we want to understand the ontological structures that make reality possible, what we're going to have to do is, listen very carefully, and in Heidegger's specific program, look at the event of presence
Sure.
closer than anybody else has looked
Sure.
at it. And that's his program, but I don't think Heidegger, in broad moral terms, I think he's with Aristotle that we have a finite life. We're thrown into the world.
Mm-hmm.
We learn about it. And then at a certain point, we reach a certain age where we stop learning about it and we have to take command and make decisions. And I think Heidegger, in his life, reached adulthood and took decisions and had his career.
Sure. But I mean,
Contrast
all of that, paying attention to the intellectual structures quietly to understand them, as just the level that Nietzsche would view as understanding truth, and the level above it of art is to write things on it, to change it, to use it toolfully, so to speak, for to transcribe a new future for humanity, something like that. And that active phase of it that Nietzsche would be jumping to instantly is what Heidegger is regarding as almost an impious failure to hear, right? You're going to miss the truth if you too soon jump to trying to make art with it, right? Whereas from Nietzsche's point of view, you're always already making art with it, and the idea that you can stop at the phase of just listening is a self-delusion, right? And that contrast is just stark. When one of them thinks that if you're paying attention to reality, you're going to be oriented correctly by what actually is because you have justly let what is speak to you, and the other views that as so much just to stage one that if you don't get beyond that, you're a patsy for reality. And the point is to change it, not to hear it. So that's the immoralist commanding Nietzsche versus the pietist listening Heidegger to me. Anyway, go ahead, Joe.
Okay, that sounds to me. Am I on or muted? Okay.
Yes, you're on.
It sounds to me like what Nietzsche and Heidegger, somehow, or me, are saying is happening here, is that we sort of get down through time, inherited as it were, what these different views are, or truths and stuff. And Nietzsche is saying we have to recognize these are made up by us, and we can change them, and we must do that. That's art. And Heidegger comes along and says, well, I sort of agree with that. But before I said about trying to change these things, I might want to first listen and figure out what they are, understand them in their own terms, to see if I have anything to add. And so Nietzsche becomes sort of a little insouciant boy who won't sit still. And I don't have a truly negative thing to say about that if that insouciant boy became an entrepreneur, Elon Musk type or something. But that would be different.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my point of view, Heidegger consistently paints the Nietzschean urge to go beyond the understanding to the rewriting as a morally dangerous failure of honesty, something like that.
Sounds like a very round-spoken advice from a grandmother to an impious boy.
Maybe, but okay. I mean, I see this well, we can there's other places. I wanted to get onto some of my other. This is just the Nietzsche Heidegger contrast, and I want to get onto the other parts of. So there's a question here. Heidegger has an understanding of Nietzsche, and he kind of extends that to an understanding of the subjectivity of the whole modern project from Descartes on. And when it comes to extending the subjectivism he detects in Nietzsche back to people like Descartes, I think he's on pretty solid ground. I think he does a pretty good job of substantiating that case. There are things in a Leibniz or a Descartes, which are more trying to find a grounding in an ascertainable truth that is still objective and outside of them, but he's still right in the in understanding the subjectivism of their method and the way in which they are prescribing that to be is to be intelligible in a way that's trying to project project as possibly being only what is masterable by the mind, something like that. And so I think that extension works, right? In a way, what I'm saying is that when I look at the evidence and arguments for Heidegger's extension of his critique of modern subjectivism in Nietzsche back to the rest of the modern project, I think it basically goes through, okay? The next question is, does he manage to do the same thing when he extends it back to Plato and Aristotle? And there I think he's on a lot shakier ground. I think it's a lot thinner. I think, you know, the claim that metaphysics is one structure of the pole of the thinking dominating the thing thought back to Plato is thin if not forced, right? There's a kind of assumption there that everything you got in Plato and Aristotle had to lead so directly to Descartes that it's one tissue of metaphysics throughout, and there's no breaks or joins in it. And all of his arguments against Nietzsche not only extend to arguments against the subjectivity of Descartes, they also extend to the subjectivity of the Platonic notion of the idea, right? I have a Scottish verdict. This has not been demonstrated, right? It might be true. He's suggested it's true. He's pointed to it and claimed it, but he has not proved it, in my opinion. Now you can go look for this in other places. You can go look for this in his argument on his lecture course on Plato's Sophists, for example. There's other texts you might want to look for besides this one for where he's engaging with Plato and the notion of truth as idea. But I don't think he's managed to prove that all of metaphysics is of that same tissue, and that I would even go so far as to say the Plato he is reacting to looks a lot like Nietzsche's Plato to me. He's fairly indebted to Nietzsche for his understanding of what Plato's role is in thought, and it's Plato as the founder of the eternal, unchanging world behind the world of unfolding appearance that is the Plato that Heidegger thinks he is detecting at the origin of metaphysics. It's Nietzsche's Plato, who is the originator of the structure of metaphysics that Heidegger is trying to extend the subjectivity back to. And it's not obvious that Nietzsche's Plato is Plato. Nietzsche's Plato is a character in a Nietzschean morality tale in which Nietzsche or Zarathustra can triumph over him by reversing him and thus arriving at truth. But it's not obvious that that's the actual philosophical thought of Plato. Now, the place where I do think he's unfairly, I think he's fairly accurate about Plato is in seeing the idea, so to speak, the notion of idea as being fundamentally about ousia, or the being of beings, rather than about being itself. I think that's fair. I think that it is true that idea, whether from Socrates or Plato, is an attempt to understand the being of a being and any given on the hypothesis that to be is to be something. And to be a something is to have a definition and therefore a shape or outline or ends. But it's fair to say that that is it's fair to say that the idea notion is aimed at the particular being rather than being itself. So I'm trying to give him his due about what I think he does have right about actual historical Plato. But the claim that a fully understood actual historical Plato gives rise necessarily to this tradition of metaphysics and no other possible tradition, not demonstrated. We'll go into a bunch of that when we get to Gilson and so forth, but all the places that all the people who disagree with Plato already, even Aristotle is to be disagreeing with Plato on how essential, if I can put it this way, how essential being is, how ideal-like being is. And there's plenty of rich history from the pre-Socratics, even before Plato's idea notion, down to the late scholastics, but all before Descartes, that is, to me, a more varied and interesting story than the cartoon version we are given here. And to me, the version we're given here is fundamentally indebted to Nietzsche's categorization of Plato and the ancients as the originators of the notion of the ideal world behind the world, right? That's the version of Plato that is enshrined here as Platonism and detected at the beginning of metaphysics. It's Plato. Nietzsche would have to be completely right about Plato for this to go through, and this is again not demonstrated. Anyway, reactions to all that.
Well, that's quite revelatory. I hope I can say something more substantive here at this moment in time. So the real Plato, as opposed to Nietzsche's Plato, is
Yes.
one that you've more nearly clarified right this most recent minutes. And for that, I welcome. Thank you very much. Now, when did the more or less mistaken, let us call it, Nietzschean interpretation of Plato, which Heidegger learned probably because he, for some reason, his scholarship sort of didn't carry through, and he sort of followed an interpretation that he didn't examine. Because if he's such a classical
he
thing,
does examine Plato fairly seriously himself, right? In stuff on this office in particular, and similarly some of the pre-Socratics before Plato. When he examines Parmenides, I don't think he treats his metaphysics as seriously as he should. I think if he did, he would see metaphysics in Parmenides that before Plato. And then so there's ways in which he's reading this so that it fits the later scheme, if I can put it that way. But he is certainly perfectly capable of looking at the original things themselves and seeing, you know, many of the same thoughts. There are characteristic blindnesses. We talked about one of them, but the, you know, can he see anything higher than being? There's another thought. Okay, so if the problem with the ousia notion of being in Plato is that it's the being of the beings as the some things that can be defined, is the negation of the some things that can be defined, the infinite that cannot be defined, or the infinite undefined. If the being that is supposedly forgotten is the infinite undefined, how to put it? It looks a little bit like this is the history of nothing happening to being again. It's the infinite undefined that is being contrasted with Plato's being of the beings. Were there any Platonisms that contrasted an infinite undefined with the being of the beings of the ideas, and even interpreted that as the nothing and put it at the basis of being? The answer is yes. That was the metaphysics of Dionysius the Areopagite and Scotus Euregina in you know, originally in late classical worlds, periods influenced by Plotinus, but especially in some of the early Eastern Orthodox Christian metaphysics that was, you know, made it into the West with Scotus Euregina in the Irish 9th or 10th centuries or so, 8th or 9th centuries. But anyway, the point is that some of these metaphysical possibilities are more explored in the history than Heidegger is letting on. And Heidegger fits more inside some of those metaphysical schemes than he is letting on. There are schematizations of metaphysics and its possible positions and moves into which Heidegger fits more easily than he would tell you, and in which his positions are anticipated. I can put it that way. So the idea that metaphysics is something which is a minor historical thing that is based upon the notion of being as enduring presence, as ousia, as the being of the beings, coming from Plato, and that we can get beyond all that as soon as we recognize this thing has a history, that may be too small a view of what metaphysics is. A more expansive view of what metaphysics is might be big enough that among its possibilities, Heidegger neatly resides as someone who is claiming that an active nothing is the base concept. By an active nothing, I mean affected by the category of time and an infinite undefined from which things arise, which was not a thought alien to previous metaphysics. It was a thought perfectly genial to several positions in previous metaphysics that were perfectly within the metaphysical tradition, so to speak.
Yeah, that sounds like that's like chaos. Once again, it's the
Yes.
original sort of background thought that originated.
Yes, but chaos understood in the chasm sense, not in the disorder sense. And that's kind of what you already had in some of these later Neoplatonists and even medievals. They will tell you, of all the names of God, the one which is least misleading is nothing.
Right.
Right.
Very good. Very good.
So anyway, I wanted to point out those traditions as another place where it's not clear we've gotten the whole story on metaphysics from Heidegger. And I'm doing this partly, I don't think we will get into that level of detail or that level of exhaustiveness in Gilson. We won't. But at least tracing the notions of being through a bunch of that history, we will get. And the parts that run from Plato to Descartes will get rather more attention than they got in the Heidegger we read, at least. So I'm partly just setting up for what we could we could read next. Speaking of
By
which,
the way,
yes.
how long do you want to allot for? I've struggled through the first 5 pages of the first chapter of Gilson.
Yes.
And I need more motive. The point remains that do you want to do 2 weeks or 4 weeks or how much big? And 2 chapters, 1 chapter. Think about how grouping.
Right. Right. So
you may not have done this yet. I don't want to push you, but you may not have done this.
I think we should probably. I mean, the chapters do sometimes have like natural splits within them, so you could split some of these chapters into 2 things, but they're only 30 or 40 pages each, right? Roughly 40 pages each. So I think
30 of tiny type of incredibly dense, verbiage that one has to read more. Yeah. Okay, I get you.
Agreed. But if we want to get through it, like 5 sessions for 5 chapters. If we split them, it's 10 sessions, and we're talking about another year-long project. And I think that's a little bit too much. So I think we should not split them.
Split 1 or 2 of them if you think is appropriate.
I think we should not
slide
split
them if we don't finish. Yeah. Okay. Or let us. Well.
I think we should. If you get through the first philosopher in a chapter and understood all of it, and you skim the other part and you don't necessarily get all of it, and you wait to hear more from me, I can live with that. But make an attempt at reading each chapter is the plan I would have.
As long as we have a video recording.
You will have video recording
that can
afterwards.
Be useful.
Yes.
That's usefully combined with rereading a chapter.
Yes. Okay. So the first we're going to skip the introduction, the preface rather, which is just talking about William James and such, and we're going to start with chapter 1 on being in the one. This is pages 1 through 40. Now I can read this in 2 weeks, but you guys might want 3. But I think those are the numbers, right? 2 weeks or 3 weeks for 40 pages of Gilson. Joe is saying 2. The third doesn't help. Pete, any thoughts? I don't know if you're doing this stuff.
No, I have stuff coming up with work in November.
I understand.
And, I might join it later on, but right now I have other things going on.
Fair enough. Brian, are you going to be joining us for the Gilson? And do you have thoughts on 2 weeks or 3 for 40 pages of it?
Yes, I will join you, and I could do it in 2. It's fine with me, or 3.
All right, let's go for 2 then. If we have 2 votes for 2 and 1 vote for not going to be here, or maybe not going to be here, let's say for the 15th, the first 40 pages of Gilson for next time. I can give you a little bit of preface of what this chapter is about. This chapter is about Plato and Platonism, basically. So the being in the one part is going to be thinking especially in terms of Plotinus, but it's also going to be the one of Parmenides, and it's going to be the one of Platonism. But the claim being made here is that there's a continuous tradition from Parmenides through Plato to Plotinus to some of the Christian theologies that were influenced by that, that is recognizable as a continuous tradition. That continuous tradition is, from Gilson's point of view, characterized by the following. Being is identity, right? It's this in Parmenides, we talk about being is the same, and being and not being is the same and not the same. Identity, definition, essentiality, all of these things being equated with being and united by the notion of sameness or the notion of oneness is the thought here. A being is that which is truly a one, something like that. And they may have different definitions of that, but fundamentally, this is something like the thought that the mathematical essence of something, the mathematically the defined identity of a mathematical concept of something, the oneness of the concept is the meaning of the essence and essentiality is the same S in being, right? So essentiality and being equated through the notion of one or identity. The following chapters, you can look ahead and you see the next one as being in substance. It's going to all be about the Aristotelian objection to all this, right? It's going to bring in substance and the particular and so forth, and it's going to be bringing in not just Aristotle himself, but also later Aristotelians like Averroes, right? But the first, if I can put it this way, the first chapter is kind of about the classical Platonist view of being, and then the next chapter is going to be the Aristotelian objection to or replacement for the classical Platonist view of being. So the whole first chapter should be thought of as being, you're going to get the Parmenides to Plotinus view of Platonism and being. Now, the fundamental, that's what the whole chapter is about. That's what unites it. There's still a division within it. And the big division within it is when you go from Plato to Plotinus, right? Everything before Plato is, the Socratic view, the Platonic view. Plotinus is a Neoplatonist, and he's going far beyond where Plato himself was in certain directions, but and in directions which wind up being more amenable to theology in a way, but or ontotheology in Plato in Heidegger's version of it. But the chapter itself has a natural dividing line where you get Parmenides and Plato as the first part, and then you get Plotinus as the second part, and some things about what Plotinus influences as well. But fundamentally, two halves here: everything through Plato, and then Plotinus after Plato. But all of them in that same Platonic tradition, if I can put it that way. So even though Aristotle, pops up in between Plato and Plotinus, he's not going to talk about Aristotle in chronological order, so to speak. He's going to give you the Platonic tradition of the people that never took the Aristotelian objections to Plato seriously, right? First, the first tradition is just going to be the unbroken Platonist tradition. Okay, and then we'll get into where the Aristotelians are after that. And when he says the Aristotelians, he's going to be talking about Aristotle himself, but also Islamic Aristotelians like Averroes and modern Aristotelians who are influenced by Averroes, like Sigurd of Brabant, who's like thought of as a Christian Averroist, right? He's going to take you through to the High Middle Ages, some of the figures in scholasticism, but chapter 2 is going to be an unbroken treatment of what the Aristotelians say about being, basically. All right, so that's just giving you an overview of where we're going and what the first couple of sessions are going to be about. If you have difficulty understanding what the heck he could be talking about in being in the one, certainly parts of it can be hard, but they're hard just because Platonism is hard, because it's very abstract. But all of chapter 1 is being to Platonists. Any questions about that?
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is take the book I have and Xerox every page with an enlargement factor.
So you can read
and
it,
then
yes.
I'll have to also, on individual sheets, I can go further and scan them into PDFs if I wanted to and have them visually. So I will definitely read this chapter. It's going to be a nice tour of the Platon.
I can give you a couple other warnings about Gilson. So Gilson himself is not a Platonist, right? He's not simply an Aristotelian either. He's fundamentally an Aquinian, right? Which means he's more on the Aristotelian end of the spectrum between the two of them, but he's adding something extra to Aristotelianism, so to speak, that he thinks he finds in Aquinas. His own reading of Aquinas might be idiosyncratic in some respects on that, although I don't think it's that idiosyncratic. I think it's typical of Thomas in the 20th century. But understand that when he's giving you Plato, he is a well-informed teacher of it who understands the doctrine of Platonism, but he's also a hostile witness, right? He's going to be telling you what Plato thinks in part to make it seem like there's an obvious mistake in it, or it is ripe for superstition by something better, right? Something like that. Does he understand Platonism with perfect clarity? I think the answer would be no. He understands parts of it with perfect clarity. He doesn't understand all of it with perfect clarity, because he's not a Platonist. But he still is trying to be fair to these people. He's enough of a scholastic in that respect that he tries to state the opinions of his opponents clearly in order to distinguish his own, he thinks, superior position from them. He's not trying to mischaracterize them, but you can leave it an open question. Has he fully understood them? So when you're reading the first chapter, understand you're reading what the Platonists think about being from a man who is not a Platonist, right? Okay. One of the reasons I wanted to do this whole thing is just so that I think by the end of this book in 5 sessions, you will not be able to take seriously anyone who says no one before Heidegger cared about the problem of being. They cared about a different problem of being. They cared about it differently. Those are all fair statements. But the problem of being is a traditional philosophical problematic that was, a stable chestnut of philosophy from Parmenides to the late scholastic period, to right up until Descartes. And in some ways afterwards, the people afterwards are more or less recapitulating positions of people earlier in that debate, whereas the positions themselves are kind of staked out between the period Parmenides to Descartes. It's useful to, not useful. You could easily be so ensconced in modern philosophy that you do not know that this history exists, or that these traditions are this rich, or that there is that much they were talking about. Philosophy did not begin with Descartes. Let's put it that way. Okay. This could wind up being a shorter session, but I'm going to give everybody else a question to ask. Sorry, a chance to ask me questions or anything else about the wanting to assess. I notice that we haven't gotten that far in the direction of influences, and so forth. But we could. But are there other questions people have about the Heidegger we've just done?
So I just want to respond to some of the stuff you've said, that Heidegger interprets Plato in a certain way. And yes, he does, but he's not trying to explain the pure Plato. He's interested in how Plato has been interpreted by everybody after him.
Sure. Because he's tracing the question of influence. Yeah. In history.
And so when he's worried, so Plato, we have the dialogues he wrote. We don't have any textbook or anything else. But then he's, interpreted in different ways at different times. And there's this history of metaphysics, which in a sense is the history of the interpretations of Plato and Aristotle by the Neoplatonists, by Averroes or Avicenna, the scholastics, and so forth. So, Heidegger's not primarily concerned with a critique of what was original in Plato, but how Plato has been interpreted afterwards in different epochs.
Yes, and I just noticed that the version of Plato's influence that he sees in almost all those epochs is Nietzsche's Plato, not, say, the Plato of Plotinus or the Plato of Scotus Erigena or the Plato of Duns Scotus, right? Or the Plato that Aristotle is breaking lances against, right? And not agreeing with, right? The Plato that is the inventor of the true world behind the world upon which morality rests, right? Is the Plato of enduring presence and the unchanging. That's the Plato that he detects in all of these places, because that's the Plato that Nietzsche sets up as the thing which he consciously wants to invert, right? And it's not obvious. It's not obvious that that is the Plato that influenced all these other people in all these other ways throughout this richer history.
Absolutely, because like Nietzsche's the latest one, so he's the 19th century interpretation after all these other interpretations.
Yes.
And the other thing is,
I'm just pointing out there's a way in which that's Heidegger thinks that because he is a historical philosopher tracing influences, as you rightly point out, he thinks that the most recent philosopher who has the most influence now, his interpretation of the past philosopher is the one which is most current and interesting for live future possibilities now. And there's a notion of progress in that, or a notion of none of the moves ever get undone, none of the old debates ever get revived, which is at cross purposes to Heidegger's own project. Because Heidegger is all about reawakening the question of being that was lost back in the pre-Socratics, right? He's all about, going back and reigniting old debates and following trails not taken in a distant, involved past. But when it comes to figuring out which Plato needs to be reacted to, it's Nietzsche's Plato, because that's the one that's influential now, because Nietzsche's the one who's influential now, right? So those two are kind of at cross purposes with each other, is all I'm pointing out.
and so the other thing to push back is the notion that, nobody talked about being until Heidegger. And when Heidegger's saying being's been forgotten, he's not saying nobody, used to on or substantia or res extensa. He's saying that other people talked about being, but they each had a particular or interpretation, or maybe not a unique, but over time, different ages had different understandings of being. But what they were calling being which in some cases might be the material of a thing or the form of a thing, that they're not asking the fundamental question of being. Yes, they are talking about being.
Right.
They have
The fundamental
the
question
word,
of being that they're not asking is,
what makes all those possible understandings of being possible? Well, what are the conditions for the
right,
possibility?
but that's only a unifying unifying a conceptual history understanding of what's fundamental to the question of being. There's another one, which is what makes the being of the actual being be its being as opposed to merely its essence or the substance out of which it is made. And philosophers before him did ask that question, right? The notion that the being of something is something like the act whereby it exists as the particular thing that it is in time. This is not an alien thought to some of the scholastics, right? The notion that these things have to be understood upon the category of time is not something which they were unaware of. It is true that the Platonists didn't think of it that way, but that's one tradition. And there are later people who are definitely disagreeing with that, precisely in the direction of being as actuality and as transpiring in time, in precisely the direction that Heidegger is pushing the question, right? He's not the first one to push the question in that direction, is what I'm trying to say. Aristotle was already starting to push in that direction when he went to the being of the material particular as opposed to the being of the abstract concept. But the medieval Aristotelians and even the post-Aristotelians were pushing it even more that way when they wanted the existence of something to be distinguished from the essence of something, because the essence of something was eternal and therefore wasn't the existence of the thing, right? There's something about existence which is about actuality in time, and that problematic was precisely what the whole later medieval debate was about, right? So anyway, I think partly this is Heidegger himself learned a heck of a lot from those traditions, more than he lets on in some of his later philosophy. It's not like he didn't study these people, right? He studied them extensively. And I think that some of his, the nuanced level of his understanding of the senses of being in part comes from having read the scholastics more deeply than most of the people he's talking to, right? And most of the people he's talking to don't know those debates even existed, right? You ask a typical modern continental philosopher, what was the difference between the position of Averroes, Aquinas, and Duns Scotus on what existence meant, and they will draw a complete blank. They won't have the slightest idea. But that you can't accuse Heidegger of that, because he, did dissertations on them and so forth. Sorry, you have more things to push back on? Because I like when you push back on these things. It's good. It keeps me honest. But Brian wants to jump in. Go ahead, Brian.
At some point, I'd like to hear you say a little bit about the individuals that Heidegger influenced, or the schools that he influenced. Either point me in some direction or say something about it.
Sure. So there are several different schools. One is the most obvious. Derrida is highly influenced by Heidegger. Another would be Emmanuel Levinas, and continue the phenomenological tradition of Husserl, basically, but heavily influenced by Heidegger. I mentioned previously Merleau-Ponty, whose work on the phenomenology of perception was heavily influenced by, especially the Heidegger of being in time. And there's lots of what we would call postmodernist schools that come out of pieces of those. I don't think that most people would put a Levinas in that category, even though he's post-Heidegger, certainly. But certainly people would put people like Derrida and Merleau-Ponty in that category. So there's lots of later postmodernists who are heavily indebted to Heidegger, many of them also for Derrida's take on Heidegger, as opposed to a direct take on it. Besides those, there's also his direct students, people like Hannah Arendt, Karl Lowith, Gadamer. These were all people who were direct students of Heidegger, who went on to become, important intellectuals in their own right in history or literary criticism or cultural studies generally. There's also, go ahead.
Here in the States, Strauss is huge, the most
Sure.
influential of
Sure.
his students.
Who's that?
Strauss. He was the political philosophy professor at University of Chicago.
Yep.
From the 30s through to the 60s.
Yep.
And like Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind,
Yep.
was his student.
I would say they're influenced as much by Nietzsche as by Heidegger.
K-R-A-U-S-S? Is it K-R-A-U-S-S?
No, not Krauss. Strauss. S-T-R. Leo Strauss. S-T-R-A-U-S-S.
Oh, right. I got his book. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So and in that same tradition, you could put people like Rosen, who was influenced by Strauss.
Now, I have to say, in general, I was just let me say in general, I'm drawn to this course, but in particular, you said that we'd be getting into the postmodernists, and that's something that I was really interested in. So if you could point me in a direction there, I would have, I'd appreciate it. You mentioned in general, but not in particular.
And I just did this
particular?
in another talk,
in particular?
another reading recently. So I can give you a quick summary from that talk. And the other influences on Sartre and existentialism,
sure,
who misunderstood him. But in 1945, French existentialism was the hot new philosophy. It was on Time magazine.
Yes.
These people in Parisian cafes
they made Hollywood movies about it.
And Sartre does a public talk in 1945 called Existentialism as a Humanism. Mm-hmm. And there he kind of describes what he means by existentialism. And he points to Heidegger's Being in Time, which had been partially translated at that time. And Sartre had read Being in Time while he was a prisoner of war. The German chaplain said, "Oh, you're a philosopher. And do you want anything?" And he said, "Yeah, can you get me a copy of Being in Time?" And so he read that in prison camp in 1940. And so in 45, he's pointing to Heidegger as the guy who's figured out the nitty-gritty of existentialism, and Sartre is moving on and explaining how to apply it to the French resistance or when you're sitting in a cafe. And Heidegger, who's slowly coming back from the war, he's completely been destroyed. He bet on the wrong person. He's up in front of the denazification committee in Freiburg that the French military's running. And he finds out about Sartre. And first he tries to, sort of make friends, ingratiate himself with Sartre. But within a year, he's figured out that he can come back. He's got his confidence back. So he's going to push back against Sartre, because really Sartre has got it all wrong. What Heidegger was trying to explain, Sartre is still a Cartesian. He can't get away from that. So Heidegger writes a letter called the Letter on Humanism to the French philosophers. And then this becomes hugely influential on the French generation after Sartre, because Sartre is now the man, and the next generation has to rebel against him. And they can use this letter on humanism, which is very erudite and makes good criticism of Sartre. And so Derrida, Foucault, Baudrillard, the whole post-structuralists then kind of, even though they might not read Heidegger or understand him, they then take this letter on humanism as their way to respond to the generation of Sartre and Merleau-Ponty's and the Sartre generation in that sense. And then also Heidegger's books on Nietzsche are published by the early 60s. And there's a book called The New Nietzsche that comes out by the early 70s that starts with one of Heidegger's essays and then has essays on Nietzsche by Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, some of these other people. And then that becomes the standard understanding of Nietzsche for in the 70s and 80s. And I can remember when I got to college in 1980, I went to, I was going to go do engineering, but I went to see what they had in the college bookstore for the philosophy students. And The New Nietzsche was one of the, books that they were reading for their intro to Nietzsche. So that's my
that's fair for a big part of the history. You're right that Sartre was like and taking him down was kind of the thing the postmodernists were all doing, right, in one way or another. The Sartre and the generation around him was the sort of reigning leftist public intellectual of immediate post-war France that everybody was making their name by taking a piece out of, so to speak. There were different schools doing that. There was the folks he just talked about reacting to letter on humanism. There was other people that were reacting to Kojève's teaching of Hegel at the École Normale Supérieure and there in Paris. And there were other people who were coming out of the Frankfurt School in Germany that were different ways of putting together some of the thoughts of Nietzsche and Heidegger with earlier left thought. So people putting them together with Freud, or people putting them together with Marx, like Adorno and Marcuse, or also thought of as postmodernists in different tradition. And Merleau-Ponty was in Sartre's set, and he jumped instead to the Kojève set. And a lot of these people were reading Hegel and tried to reread Hegel in ways that were informed by Nietzsche and Heidegger, because they knew that Hegel was kind of the basis of Marx. And the real question was, what do you have to update about Marx now that Hegel himself has been taken down by Nietzsche and Heidegger, so to speak? But Pete is right that a lot of the younger generation, the Foucaults and the Derridas, were making their spurs, so to speak, by finding the ways in which they could disagree with the Sartres and Merleau-Ponty's. Who are also involved in a lot of these post-war debates about Stalinism and the revelations and crimes of Stalin in the early 50s. There's a famous debate between Sartre and Kessler of Darkness at Noon fame about humanism and terrorism. Anyway, all of this was a very highly charged debate in the immediate post-war France. By the time you're in the 50s and 60s, people like Derrida and Foucault are writing their books in ways that are slyly taking down that previous generation, and you have to sort of know a heck of a lot to realize that the previous generation is being taken apart. By the 70s, it's out in the open. That post-68, it's pretty much out in the open that they're the postmodernists are in revolt against those earlier generation of French intellectuals. But at the time when Foucault is writing Madness and Civilization, you have to know a lot of Nietzsche and a lot of Freud to realize that he's making fun of Freud on a Nietzschean basis, basically. So similarly, in some of Derrida's early most influential works later, it wasn't influential at the time, it was influential later, he's reading Heidegger himself directly in a way that most of these other people are not, and learning a lot from him. All of these people had read Nietzsche. All of these people had read Marx. Most of them had read people like, Sartre and Camus and so forth. The ones that go straight to Heidegger and get it from the source get farther, so to speak. But the whole cultural understanding that is there in Nietzsche and Heidegger heavily informed that whole set, especially in France. There was another, there were two other ongoing traditions. One that Pete mentioned was among the exiles in the U.S. that included some of the, included people like Strauss, and included people like some of the Frankfurt School people who had landed there. And also in Germany, especially post-war Germany, where Heidegger started producing again, and some of the students were also producing, people like Gadamer. So the French tradition was the one that most directly blossomed into postmodernism, but there was also elements of the exile, so to speak, in the U.S. Influenced by the Nietzsche, Heidegger, Frankfurt School side of things. Not all, but most. And then also just the direct, not really usually thought as postmodernists, but kind of in the orbit, the direct students of Heidegger, people like the Gadamers and the Arendts and so forth, who had their own take on all these things. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
You mentioned Marcuse, and I lived in San Francisco, and there was still a Marcuse influence in Berkeley, other California universities. They still referred to Marcuse when I lived there.
Yeah, and Marcuse's kind of claim to fame was putting together Marx and Freud with having imbibed enough Nietzsche and Heidegger to not completely botch the job, so to speak. But whereas someone like Adorno out of the same school is really just trying to apply Nietzsche directly to sort of the cultural criticism that the Marxists are so crap at, because they're too busy thinking about economics to notice culture. And then Foucault is, using Nietzsche to take apart Freud. Freud is another one of these things which had an incredible vogue in France. Just like Sartre had made existentialism famous, there were lots of people that were making Freud famous, and taking the Freudians down a peg was sort of what Madness of Civilization was all about. Its kind of direct target is Civilization and Its Discontents, an essay by Freud. And then in the case of Derrida, he takes on, there was an immense cachet of structuralism in the form of linguistic structuralism with Saussure from the 30s, and then Levi-Strauss and anthropology, and those were sort of the big things. Where structuralist anthropology and linguistics was one of the hottest things on the French intellectual scene, and so Derrida decides to take that apart, right? And so he uses a bunch of Heideggerian technology, so to speak, to both advance his claim to be doing something more fundamental than Heidegger, and especially to win his spurs by showing that he can take on Saussure and Levi-Strauss and the structuralist positions. He also much more obscurely took on some of the reinterpretations of Hegel. People like Jean Hippolyte, who had been reinterpreting Hegel in light of some Nietzsche, especially, but also Heidegger to some degree, and Derrida wrote very he wrote articles that took away their public reputation in part by accusing them of ontotheology, if I can put it that way. But there's so much Hegel in them that it's just theism. They've just covered up the offending God term to try to make it look left. Was sort of Descartes' attitude towards people like Jean Hippolyte. But the point is that Pete is right that a bunch of these younger generations are making their name by puncturing the pieties of, or the positions of, the other previous philosophical schools, whether those are structuralism or Marxism of the more traditional variety, or Hegel or Sartre as too shallow a reading of Heidegger, etc. And postmodernism kind of comes out of that whole stew as the positions which are most evolutionary fit in that landscape, if we can put it that way. The things that win in those debates and capture the minds of the students in next generation are the things that kind of coalesce by the 70s into postmodernism in France, and that sweeps through the American and English academies in the 80s, really. But that a huge portion of all of the intellectual heft and force that those writers have is coming from the fact that they have already digested Nietzsche and Heidegger in one form or another. And it means that all of their criticisms of the other people that around them are just philosophically much more heavyweight than the folks they're taking on. Okay.
I'd like to ask about just one person I don't know, read some summaries of, Jürgen Habermas. Do you know about him?
Sure. He's kind of later and in that whole tradition, and he's trying to be a bit more center of the road reasonable. He's fundamentally more of an Hegelian rehabilitator of Hegel in all of that. And there's a tradition of those people too. Is he a postmodernist? He's kind of reacting against all of the Nietzschean and Heideggerian strands of the other postmodernists around him by saying all those are great reasons to go back to Hegel and be as reasonable as Hegel instead of as unreasonable as these people later. So his big thing is to rehabilitate Hegel with the addition of the understanding of the intersubjective. So the intersubjective is the whole realm of those things which exist in the way that opinion exists, or the way language exists, that are neither objective nor subjective, but are the intersubjective. And the Heideggerian influence of that is the they self understanding in being in time, is sort of a proto version of the intersubjective. But he's updating Hegel with the categories of the intersubjective and some of this stuff, but fundamentally he's shoring up Hegel against the Nietzschean, Heidegger, and postmodern arguments against Hegel. The other person kind of in that tradition is Kojev, we mentioned, who is also a rehabilitator of Hegel. But if I would draw the tradition, it would be, Hegel, all these people, attacking Hegel, Kojev saying, you can't simply dismiss it, and Habermas trying to make it as reasonable as possible in the modern day. But a postmodern Hegelian is the way I would characterize Habermas. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and we put Joe to sleep. It's okay. Good questions. If Joe isn't going to wake up and ask another one, then I'm going to give you one more shot, and then I'm going to call it. That's 3 hours.
Yeah, I was just going to say the reason I was late was a time change here in Washington.
Oh, gotcha. Yes.
I was thinking, I looked at the meetup and it said Mountain Time, and I thought, I wonder if they shifted.
Yeah.
It's
so
after 12. Let me check.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we don't move our time here in Phoenix, but everybody else does. So we still, everybody's cross schedules just get screwed up anyway. And I just got back from Colorado, so I had a time change, even though I from Mountain Daylight Time to Mountain Standard Time or whatever. It's not even changing your time zone; it's just changing the S to a D or something, or D to the S. All right, so I'll put something on the calendar for the 22nd, same time, and Gilson chapter 1, and we'll see some of you then. And Pete, if you manage to join us, great. If later, I understand. But it was a heck of a lot of fun. You've been a very good addition to these. Lots of good input all along the way. I want to thank you for that profusely.
Hey, to me, it's really propitious. It's been really good for me. And I saw when you started this, I think late last year, and I was really jealous that here in Seattle, nobody was doing Heidegger. Well, actually, did a Being in Time one last winter. But then when COVID came along and you put it online, it was great.
Perfect. Yep. Couldn't have happened at a better time. Yeah. Okay.
I have one more question.
Sure, go.
For Pete and the others, and for you, but with the COVID thing, I'm interested in finding more philosophy groups online. or courses online. How do I do that?
All right. So there's something called the Virtual Philosophy Network.com. And that started a few months ago. I'm not quite sure where they are today, but the general idea was that all these meetup groups, and there's also some other servers for reading groups, like Discord is turning out to be popular, that all the people in the same time zone can now meet because they're all virtual, they're not local.
Yeah.
And so you can either, search around other meetup groups. The Toronto one has gone big virtual. They have like dozens of talks a month. And the Seattle analytical philosophy one, which is almost no analytical philosophy. That's what they named it when they created it 10 years ago, but they found out people wanted to talk about Nietzsche and Plato, the textbook they had as an undergraduate. So they have like dozens of talks a month. And like yesterday, they had one on David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. A bunch of philosophers watching the movie and criticizing. But the Virtual Philosophy Network.com is supposed to be the umbrella organization to try to, get all these different groups that used to be local are now meeting online to try to help them publicize so they can get wider audiences. So, if you wanted to do a meetup on Spinoza in Seattle last year, probably you wouldn't get enough people. But now there's probably enough Spinoza curious specialists online that maybe do a reading of the ethics. So that's we're trying to do that. So you can look at the other meetup groups or go to the virtualphilosophy.network.com. I think they were trying to put together a master calendar, but I'm not sure where they are right now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's good. More than I've got. All right.
Bye,
okay.
Joe.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
If we stop recording, will they wake up?